So as a person who's ultimately responsible for releasing good products onto the market, oh my goodness, what a can of worms this is that we're looking at here, and the risks. You know, we spent 20, 30 years really developing, verifying and validating the packaging we put our product in, and now we've been forced by regulators due to the green movement and so on, which I'm not wanting to say is anything wrong with that. It's great. It's great to see the Europeans allowing enough time to get some validation in. But the questions are, you know, how do we manage the plasticizers? How do we manage migration with glue and ink on the bottles? How do we work so the regulator is as ready as we are to start producing this stuff? How do we manage contaminants in an environment where contaminants are constantly getting lower and lower in terms of what we're allowed to have? I didn't hear a lot of talk about shelf life and the functionality of products at the end of shelf life, especially when we're going to a 3-layer barrier to a 1-layer, which doesn't exist today. And there's a whole range of things around that. How many times, for example, can one plastic bottle be recycled before it starts to become fragile or another issue? We heard today about plasticizers, phthalates, DCD, a number of other things. How do we convince the consumer that what they're going to get is going to perform and be as safe as what it used to be at the end of the day? Thanks. I don't know who wants to answer that.
Which question do you want to answer?
The regulator side of things?
Well, I think there were at least 4 questions in there. I'm not sure which one you want to pick first.
The regulator coming up to speed or being ready? How about that one?
That was with reference to inks and glues, wasn't it?
Well, I think when it comes to the regulator, you know, all our products are approved by the regulator. I noticed Vince has conveniently disappeared. But yeah, there's a big responsibility in the regulator to make sure the packaging's safe. We wouldn't use it unless the regulator put a stamp on it. So in terms of industry, our validations, our functionality, versus the regulator, we both have to be up to speed at the same time.
I might jump in there if it's all right.
Go ahead.
I think this is where the working group that I mentioned is actually going to play a really big role, because you know there's a group of us from across government, industry, and I'm assuming that we also have toxicologists and all sorts of others coming together to look at these specific issues and how we can actually close those loops. There is also a lot of focus on this internationally. So, you know, a lot of the guidelines that we're going to see coming out of Europe, for example, I imagine are going to be looking at some of those issues, particularly around the chemicals, the inks, those sorts of things as well. On the how many times can you recycle your packaging, this is why we need a mix of both mechanical. Sorry, I'm getting feedback, guys. A mix of both mechanical and chemical. You know, there is a limitation in how many times 100% recycled content can go back to 100% and round in a circle. It's a lot more than what you'd think, listening to social media science. But you know, eventually it does get to that point, but that's where the chemical recycling can really play a part in rebuilding the molecular chains back to that virgin level quality.
Does that address enough of your questions?
I think it's just something that the industry, the regulators... I think it's just something that the industry, the regulators, the academics, the green movement all need to work together on to come with a solution, because at the moment there's far more questions than perhaps what there is answers. In defence of all that, Emily and I visited in Melbourne what I would consider an excellent, needs a bit more validation, but an excellent plastic recovery of milk bottles, I think. And if I hadn't seen it with my own two eyes, I wouldn't have believed they would have been able to do it as well as what they are. So there is progress out there.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Hey, actually, I thought your questions there, or rhetorical questions, whatever they were excellent. The interesting question, or it's not a question, it's a comment. Is it the regulator's responsibility, or under, let's say, the Animal Products Act or the Food Act, is it the food manufacturer's responsibility to make sure they produce safe and suitable food? But alongside that, the regulator will work with you, as you suggest, to ensure that we're getting the best for the country and actually internationally, because we'll be working with Codex and with other organisations. One of the other comments I wanted to make, though, was, and this is not a question, although you might want to comment on it, is Jeff talked about the toxicological risks. Nobody actually talked about the microbiological risks. Now, from a food safety perspective, not so much from the shelf life perspective. And one of the issues we've been looking at is let's say, chicken packs. You've noticed that the outside packaging is fully recyclable, but the old soaker pads weren't. So the industry changed, and these were designed in Australia, I understand, and put the little dimples in the bottom to soak up the drip from. But is anybody here, this is a question for everybody, who here's tried washing one of those before you recycle it? Do you see what happens to all the water from the tap? It just splatters around your kitchen. So, and this is where it comes back to my comment, and I wasn't trying to be nasty at all, that it is an industry responsibility as well to understand all of those hazards and how those hazards turn into risks, and not just the tox side, not just the recycling side, but everything else that can possibly happen. So if anybody can actually work out how to wash those without using a whole sink load of water and slowly sinking them in, I'd like to hear.
Maybe answer that question as Roger. Yeah. Emily, do you want to address the first question around whose responsibility it is?
Absolutely, yeah. Agreed, food industry is responsible for putting safe food on the market, absolutely, but there is a role for regulator, especially when we're looking at the regulations that we're seeing around the world as exporters, and we need to meet, otherwise we have a trade barrier, right? We can't get into those markets, and there is a role for the regulator in there, so absolutely the regulator needs to come to the table with food industry right about now and work together.
Thank you. Plastic is ubiquitous, which in 2030 means that recycled plastic is going to be ubiquitous as well. So if we flash forward to that time when we need to have 70% plus recycled plastic, products that are made in New Zealand that go into overseas markets will mean that there'll be no separate stream for New Zealand if we don't have those regulations. So has anyone done any modelling for what the inflationary pressures will be when you think of a supermarket with that extra cost to make that plastic recyclable? How's that going to impact our general day-to-day life and the economy?
Wow. That's all I'm going to say to that one. To my knowledge, nobody has done that, certainly not in the New Zealand context. There is a study so I sit on a global advocacy group for the plastics industry, and they worked with Oxford Economics on a recent study looking at some of the, it was mainly around the production cap issue and the economic implications of a production cap, not just in terms of plastics pricing, but also the pricing of alternatives, because basically everything will increase as soon as you constrain it. So that may provide you with some interesting reading. But I don't know that many member states have actually got to that level of modelling as yet.
Thanks. So is it fair to say that most of our plastics come from overseas, most of our recycled plastics have to come from overseas, and the inherent risks that we don't necessarily know where they come from?
Yes, which is why local regulations around recycled content are also important.
Okay, I'm getting one more minute, I'm getting a wrap up here, so maybe we will wrap up. Thank you very much. Please join me.